Awesome. Thank you, Manish. Yay. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you all so much for taking the time to come. So I am going to give you a talk that I may or may not have written yesterday on the train. So please be patient with me and kind. We'll see how much of it I get to and how much of it I don't. Hold most questions to the end if you don't mind, but if there's anything that you don't understand about what I'm saying, please let me know during. I'm happy to clarify things. So yes, I will get right into it. This talk is mostly going to be about some of the things I've been thinking about, evaluating and thinking about generative AI harms. I come from, as Manish said, sort of trained in algorithmic fairness type work, as you guys might know, when we thought about model harms and fairness in traditional AI systems, we had sort of a lot more structure in the way that these models work that helped us understand both how to maybe test whether or not something nefarious was going on, but also evaluate to the extent to which that nefarious thing was going on. So we had, structured inputs that we had to get into some specific, format, and then we also had an output that we at least decided upon what it was going to be, right? And a lot of that time that was maybe a binary output. A lot of the fairness work focused around that. And so we had some ideas about how to kind of like test for different forms of model harms. I focused a lot on fairness, where we were thinking about disparate treatment or disparate impacts along different demographic groups. So we had definitions like demographic parity, which is, do you have two demographic groups, for example, men and women, given opportunities at the same rate from a model's decision process, stuff like this, right? So we had kind of ways that we could think about the outputs from our models and think about whether or not they were likely to cause harm or causing harm, right? And then now we have a lot of generative AI systems, and you put in kind of whatever you want, and you kind of get out whatever you want. And you don't really have to tell it how to do what you want it to do. And you can change how it works and what you're asking it to do at any point while you're using it. And basically, there's like a lot more generality here, a lot less specificity, right? And so I think that this has really impacted the way that we think about whether or not a model is causing harm, and it has really brought about a paradigm shift and stirred a lot of our thoughts about how we can think about whether or not a model is acting in a harmful way and how to understand how to quantify that harm. So, what I used to think about a lot and still think about a lot in traditional AI systems is how do we define whether or not a harm is occurring? If I think about some way that a model might be hurting someone, how do I measure it? How do I evaluate that measurement? How do I mitigate that behavior? And what legal tools do I have to make sure that people will mitigate that behavior? And I think generative AI systems change the way that we think about a lot of each of these things. So for the fact that we have such flexible outputs means that there are new modes of harm that the model can bring about that maybe are not fully encapsulated by the ways that we had thought about model harms before when we had more structured models. Because also of those flexible inputs and outputs, evaluation is crazy, as we'll talk about a lot during this talk as well. There's so much flexibility that it's hard to understand whether or not you have a reliable signal of whether some behavior is happening or not. And bias mitigations for a lot of models where you don't have access to what's going on inside for proprietary reasons, or just because it's too expensive to train and look at yourself. What can you do besides prompting? I think that's something that people are trying to figure out a lot right now as well. And then finally, people I think are really confused about what laws do and don't apply to generative AI systems and how they apply. So in this talk, I'm going to mostly talk about these three. I've been thinking about how to think about model harms in generative AI a lot, and for anyone who's interested in and wants to talk to me later, I'm happy to talk about all four things or different things about each of these three things, but generally this is where my mind's been at, and I'm going to talk to you mostly about these three that I've circled. And in particular, I'm going to talk to you mostly about a paper that discusses some technical pitfalls in generative AI harm evaluation and how that interacts with some legal frameworks and how that kind of makes things sometimes more difficult from a policy and regulation perspective. So that'll be the majority of the talk. I'll then talk very briefly about some ongoing work that I have where I talk about some other legal frameworks that are relevant to generative AI systems and how they can be used to incentivize companies to prevent harm. And then, if I have time, since this is a new talk, I will make a hard left turn and talk about some other kinds of model harm that I've been thinking about that have less to do with the law, at least that I've thought of so far. So hopefully that sounds good, and I'll get started. So first I'm going to talk about, within this work with some collaborators at Columbia, some of the technical pitfalls and legal tensions around generative AI harm evaluation. And so first, we're going to talk about a little bit some of the mismatches between the frameworks that exist and have existed for preventing decision-making harms in the law and some of the ways that generative AI mucks that up a little bit. So one thing that I think people have been making a little bit of a hullabaloo about is that at least the discrimination law statutes that we use most for preventing discrimination in all kinds of decision-making, including AI systems, work to prevent discrimination in allocative decisions. What do I mean by that? I mean, if I have an opportunity like a job or I have a loan, an allocative decision is who is getting allocated the opportunity, who gets hired, who gets the loan, right? And if there is a disparity among who is allocated those decisions, that's where traditional anti-discrimination law in the US at least steps in and says like, hey, unless under very specific circumstances, you can't have large disparities between the rate at which people of different demographic groups are allocated opportunity. And so there are some asterisks there that are important and deal with a lot of work that Manisha and I have thought about, but that's kind of the basic way things go. And so traditional machine learning models that had more structured inputs and outputs fit in well with this paradigm, because if you have a binary classification result from a model, you can just say, hey, this model would suggest to allocate opportunities to people at different rates. And so we can very easily slap on some of those definitions that I showed you guys earlier and say, okay, this seems to be acting in a discriminatory fashion that works well with the law. If you have generative outputs, where say, if we take a hiring example, you have a resume summary instead of an actual decision about whether or not someone gets hired or someone's a good match for this job, then there is at least this question that comes up that's like, can the generative AI model be held liable for maybe a discriminatory summary? It doesn't seem to really fit in well with this framework of how discrimination law works in the US. Does this make sense, this distinction between allocative and generative output? Okay, cool. So TLDR, TLDR will come later. So that's one kind of tension, is this difference between allocative and generative kind of outputs from a model and how that matches up with the discrimination framework that we have. Yes. Yes.
Is the difference that it's passing through a hiring manager before the decision? Is that the thing that's making it?
Yeah, so before we could kind of see directly if a traditional model is acting in a discriminatory fashion, and but we could match that up with the discrimination law frameworks, because we could see directly what the decisions the model was making and be like, hey, this seems to be leading to disparate impact, right? This seems to be leading to a difference in the way people of different demographic groups are treated in a way that is legally relevant. Here, as we'll discuss later, you can still check if this overall process is leading to disparities, but creating kind of legal pressure to make sure you're specifically debiasing your generative AI model when you can't really directly test to see if it's influencing allocation in any kind of direct way, that's leading to disparities in terms of who actually gets an opportunities, makes this harder to match up to the frameworks that we have.
So it's not directly leading to decision, and therefore, okay.
Yes. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, cool. Another kind of tension that exists is that there's kind of a problem in both directions, where the regulations, there are fewer than existed a few months ago, but the regulations that still do exist that ask for AI evaluation are really vague and inspecific, which allows for potentially some gaming. So it kind of just says do an evaluation according to some standardized protocols, which, as we'll see later, can sometimes lead to, with a lot of instability, can lead to unrealistic or kind of untrustworthy results. But also at the same time, there's this problem where the evaluations that do exist, at least in the academic literature so far, are both unstable and don't really map to how models are used in real life. So this is things like, a lot of evaluation techniques are based off of single-turn interactions where you just have one round of conversation with a model, but if you go later to multi-turn, this doesn't generalize. And so both like the specificity in the regulation that exists is not really enough to make sure, or at least to try a little bit to prevent that the evaluation that's done won't be gameable, but also the evaluation strategies that do exist don't meet some of the few requirements that are in the regulation, which is like, please try to make this similar to your deployment environments, and I don't think that that's happening. And then finally, this is a little bit of a lesser point, but the amount that you can change a generative AI model as you're using it in the real world also heightens this tension that has existed in the law for a long time, which is who is responsible for the discrimination that is caused. It is the person that is making the tool, or is it the person that is using the tool? So is it OpenAI that made the baseline model that's being used by an employment agency to make their hiring decision, or is it the employment agency? There are lots of situations where it's mostly the employment agency, and I'm happy to talk about that offline about problems around that. But there are other situations where there's a lot of this is kind of like an active area of discussion, and the fact that you can change a generative AI model so much as you're using it, I think really heightens this question of like, how can you possibly ask a developer to do enough testing to make sure that it will work reasonably well on the ground, but also you still need the developer to do a lot because it's unclear how to make sure a user understands how to prevent those kinds of behaviors as well. Okay, so those are kind of some, I would say, 2.5 tensions that I'm going to talk about, 3 tensions in this first part. So the first question coming from that tension with discrimination law is kind of, are GenAI systems harder to regulate due to their non-allocative outputs? Like they have these more flexible outputs that don't clearly match the discrimination law framework. And then there's this policy for deployment relevant evaluations that's being unmet by current unstable and evaluation practices, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then also exacerbating this deployer versus development tension. Okay, so really quick, actually not really quick, I'll get into kind of talking about this first tension in some detail. Which I think is really related to some of the problems with quantifying harm, so defining what your harm is in generative AI systems. And so coming back to this first tension that I spoke about, does traditional discrimination law apply to the generative outputs that we get? TLDR, yeah. I think like legally, if you have a discriminatory decision-making system, you can still check the end outputs, right, of who is getting allocated which decisions. The thing that becomes more difficult in terms of regulation is understanding where that bias is coming from and preventing it in practice, right? So like the law still applies. You still can't have discrimination in your hiring practices, in your loan application practices, in your housing distribution practices, but like you can see evidence for discrimination at this stage, and then trying to understand where in this overall decision-making system the bias is coming from, if it's coming from your generative AI model, becomes more difficult. And this is where the issue of how do we actually measure harm comes in, because when this becomes harder, it's kind of more difficult to practically reduce the discrimination that's going on that you're still liable for. Does this make sense? I've seen a bunch of people, myself included at times, being like, oh my God, maybe it doesn't apply. It does apply. It does apply. Let's all remember that. It does apply. The law still applies. So again, right, when we had more structured output, we could be like, okay, let's look at the differences in rates in which people are allocated an opportunity, and now say that we have a resume summary that's coming out of a large language model, and say that we do see, we want to understand, like, how do I think about evaluating my LLM resume summarization model to see if it might cause harm in a way that's like legally relevant, right? So my people that I worked with, my lab and I, and our collaborators, did some experiments to think about how we would test this. And so just to kind of run through what the experimental setup is, so this is to understand whether or not this kind of more flexible generative output was discriminating against people of different groups. We created some resume templates from randomly sampled traits. We created groups of like kind of, resumes based off of those templates, which were all the same. We followed, procedures from the social science literature on adding names that were tied to stereotypical names for different demographic groups to different resume templates. We then asked a generative AI model to make a summary. I'm sure you guys have seen stuff like this before, but then what we did is that we also asked a decision maker to make decisions based off of those resume summaries. So we have one generative AI model that takes a resume, like we have like maybe 5 or 6 or 10, I don't remember how many different templates, a lot of equivalent, like the exact same resume with different names from different demographic groups. We create a summary for all of those resumes, and then based off of those summaries, we ask a different decision maker, a more complex GenAI model in this case, to make a decision based off of those summaries. Now, if you maybe don't think about model harms all the time like me, you would say, okay, how am I going to think about trying to understand if these, oh, I'm so sorry. The summary does contain the names, but we did an experiment to make sure that the doubt that you have is not true. So I will show a slide with that. I'm pretty sure I can predict your question. Yeah, am I right? That you're like, is it coming from the name? Okay. Okay, word. Okay. Yes, so the summary contains the name, but we show based off of an experiment where we create the summaries without the names and then add the names on them afterwards and test the bias of the decision maker, that the bias is not coming from the decision maker but from the summary. And I'll show you a graph of that in a second. Okay, so if you were not obsessed with model harms like me, maybe you would be like, okay, maybe I'm going to test like kind of decision summarization accuracy across people of different demographic groups and make sure that the model is summarizing people, like giving at least the same factual information about all these different people in the same way, right? So I'm going to use a score that's very common in the NLP literature, Rouge score, which basically checks how accurate a summary is. We use the resumes that the summary was based on as the ground truth, and we see that for these different models that we were testing, the Rouge score within each model was not changing too much between demographic groups, right? But the interesting thing is that if you look at the selection rate difference, and these are on different scales, I'm so sorry, this is 2%, this is 4%, and 6%, just so that you all know. The selection rate difference in the downstream decision maker actually did have a larger difference in the rate at which it selected different people for the eventual interview that it was being asked to choose between people for. So if you see in particular based off of these results, maybe you would have gone with the llama model because none of them seem to have that big of a difference in their Rouge score. But these two models are kind of roughly interchangeable, I would say. But from a selection disparity perspective, this is the maximum selection disparity across any two demographic groups that we were testing. There actually can be a big difference, right? So what is this coming from? Right, hopefully that was clear. Is people good on this so far? Great. Is the unfairness coming from the hiring manager, which I assume was your question in the back, because we did give people the resume. We did give the resume summaries with the name to the decision maker. And the answer, I think, is no, because we created resume summaries without giving the name, and then we attached the names onto them post-hoc so that it would be the same or very similar baseline summaries. And we saw that the hiring manager did not choose people with very different selection rates across demographic groups. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah? Awesome. Okay, so it was in fact coming from the summary, right? And so we didn't see it in the Rouge score. Then the question kind of here is, all right, so by checking this downstream process, we know that the harm that we're trying to prevent, this like overall access to opportunity, is this bad thing is happening. We weren't able to see it with the Rouge score. What are some other things that we can do, right? So maybe we want to understand how exactly this discrimination was occurring. If we look at two resume summaries that were based off of the same baseline resume, but one for a white applicant and one for a Hispanic applicant, what we basically see is that there's a lot more kind of flowery language, kind description used in the white applicant summary, which maybe speaks more to her character for some reason, whereas for the Hispanic applicant summary, it's much more factual, right? And so this influences the sentiment. And LLM as a judge things that we did, like ranking people emotional intelligence and reliability, which might be necessary qualities for the job. We did all of our experiments based on a social work job. And so you can kind of see this is like, it's sneaky, right? This discrimination is kind of sneaky, but you can see how it would influence a downstream decision maker. And I think, it's not a perfect answer by any means. I think it's definitely an intermediate step. But I think one thing that we did see is that if you have a suite of metrics that's more related to the downstream task that you're actually using the large language models for. So in this case, we had sentiment, length, because length of a positive thing, indicates probably more positive things said about that person. LM as a judge ranking for emotional intelligence and reliability, even though there hadn't been much of a difference on RUE score between the JAMA and the LLAMA models that seemed interchangeable, you start to see a pattern of difference between these two models where maybe you would have made a different choice, right? So I think TLDR, it's hard to figure out how harm is happening from large language models, but since this paper is something that I've been more interested in and have been thinking about a lot more, is kind of how we can do more contextual evaluations for generative AI systems. So if I think about where the decision for this model is going, how can I more accurately reflect the important parts of that context in how I'm evaluating the model? And I guess the other thing that I'll say is, yeah, it's hard, but if you're like, I don't know, maybe building a startup or thinking about how to make sure that you don't build a discriminatory AI system, make sure you test the downstream thing. That is the thing that might actually cause harm in the real world, and maybe the intermediate evaluations are a little bit less important than evaluating the overall system. Yeah.
But so you have this counterfactual pipeline set up. I'm wondering if this suggests an end-to-end thing where you can say something like, from people's decisions, I can back out things that are associated with their decision making. So, for example, emotional intelligence is one of them. So, just from data, like a bunch of summaries and a bunch of decisions, I can learn
what would have been important.
What characteristics are associated with people's decision making, and then you can take that set of metrics and go back to your counterfactual tests and run that and say, does the name at the top of the resume affect emotional intelligence? Or 5 metrics are strongly associated with decision making. Is that like a viable end-to-end pipeline? That's something that you could think to?
I think so. I would have to maybe think about it a little bit more detail, but I think that sounds like the kind of thing that I would, definitely.
You just pre-specify a bunch of possible metrics that could be associated, and you hope those are the right ones.
Versus actually verify. I think that pipeline sounds like a good way to go about doing this, definitely. Yeah. Okay, cool. Any other questions on this part? Yeah. Yes. We did several, good point. I'm going to talk a lot about evaluation in the next couple of slides. We did definitely do that. The appendix to this paper is very long. I don't have all the figures up for Mo, but I think I have the paper name on one of these slides, and I'm happy to talk to you offline about those different checks that we did. I do also know for a fact that we reran the entire experiment several times and came up with the same answer because we kept on forgetting to set speeds and stuff like this. So I can also just speak from experience that we got similar results. Okay. All right. So that's kind of like, I guess, my takeaway from that. Measuring harms is hard, but I think contextual evaluations are something that I'm thinking about moving forward. Okay, now we're going to talk about evaluation instability and related policy repercussions. So let's say you've thought about the kind of harm you're trying to prevent a lot. You know what you think is relevant to it, and now you're definitely going to be trying to prevent it, right? So now you have your measurement, but how are you going to make sure that that phenomenon is actually happening or not? The next kind of case study that we talk about in this paper has to do with this method of testing for certain kinds of model harms, which is red teaming. Just in case you guys don't know what red teaming is, there's basically a one language model that is used to come up with kind of adversarial questions to query a base model that you're testing the toxicity of. And you basically see the rate at which you do get a toxic response to those adversarial questions. So this is red teaming. in the end of the Biden administration, where a bunch of executive orders were coming out about how to prevent harm in AI systems, red teaming was mentioned quite a lot. People were like, do red teaming is amazing, red teaming all the time. And so I think both, it is at the very least one of the most well-known bias evaluation techniques spoken about amongst policy folk. And so it was not ideal then when we kind of showed that depending on what model you chose as your base model that's querying which model you choose to query the model that you are testing for discrimination. So what model you're using for your red LM that's coming up with the potentially toxic questions, you can get kind of different responses different answers about how discriminatory your model is and which might be the best model to pick. So here we were testing for bias against women. So we were asking potentially questions that were leading to kind of a disrespectful, toxic answer. And the nice thing, I guess, is that we did actually see a pattern for a lot of it, but there was a situation where you could very easily come up with a reasonable construction of a measurement of this particular kind of toxicity harm that would show you that a model that seems to usually not act super fairly is in fact acting the best of the three that you're choosing from. Is that a question?
Yeah, in this case, is the red LM the one that also reads the answer and evaluates the scholarship or not?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think you could do it either way. I'm not sure how we did it in this particular test. I think that there are like toxicity classifiers that are used sometimes to decide that. I think part of the issue that we were talking about in this paper is that while like the general setup of red teaming is clear, it's like ask toxic questions, get answers, measure those responses. How you do each one of those steps can influence the results. So I think that's another area where there is kind of like a vector of difference of how you decide to evaluate those model responses, and that could lead to instability in and of itself as well. Does that answer your question? Right. It's very easy, whether you were trying to or not, to come up with an answer that would allow you to deploy a model that is potentially toxic, even if you were either trying your best to find one that wasn't or trying to find metrics that would show you that it is fair when it's not. And I think, that this slide is kind of ugly, but I think that this is based off of the underlying instability in model responses to any kind of question, not just adversarial toxic questions. But I'm sure you guys have seen some papers on this. This is just a particular example from one piece of work that I'm working on right now. Depending on exactly how you query your GenAI system, it will make different decisions based off of seemingly meaningless differences in how you form that question, right? So here we were trying to create an LLM to give advice about whether or not someone was likely to have diabetes, I believe. And so here are all these tabular features, and depending on what meta prompt we use to ask the model to give us the decision of whether or not it's likely that someone should go get checked, we can get different answers. We can get different answers in the model's decision making about whether or not someone has diabetes for something as seemingly unrelated as exactly how we put the system prompt together, right? So I think that that's where this variability and red teaming is, and I think a lot of people have been paying attention to this instability in large language model outputs based off of semantic changes in prompt and other kind of seemingly unrelated things. And I think the next thing that I'm really interested in also is, why is this happening? Can we find patterns? Can we find a way of kind of exploring the space in a meaningful way? But in terms of the policy repercussions of this instability, one is this thing that I call de-hacking, which I had a paper on. Gosh, I really am so bad at putting my papers in the bottom corner of my slides, but I swear there was a paper on this, in fact, a few years ago, where, we notice this even with traditional AI systems, but if you have an unstable evaluation procedure and you want to pass some test where a policy document says, make sure you do some evaluation, impact assessment of your model to make sure that it's not causing harm to people. If you can just tweak some parameters to design a test that says, hey, I think that this has low disparity and is safe to deploy, if that evaluation process is unstable, you can find a way to deploy a model that might actually be harmful, even if it doesn't look so in that like one example that you managed to find, right? So we call this de-hacking or discrimination hacking. And the fact that LLM evaluations are even more unstable than traditional AI systems means that this happens even more when you have generative AI models. So that is not great. Oh, I guess that's the only slide I have about the policy repercussions about that. But, the other policy repercussion, sorry, actually, is that, so the instability of the model's decision, the model's output itself is like kind of one axis of instability that makes de-hacking worse. But another downside of instability that is exacerbated by how much people can edit models, as they're deployed on the ground means that even if you have a relatively well-made evaluation set up for your model, if people are using that model in complicated ways, that evaluation might not generalize to the way that people are actually using that, and that in turn can kind of complicate this dynamic between who is liable for that model's behavior, the developer or the deployer, right? So on the top here, I have some this is essentially, we repeated the red teaming experiment from the previous slides, but we did it over multiple turns of an interaction with an LLM. So, you know, if we saw that one model was slightly less discriminatory than another model on like a one round interaction, this should start at 1, but it starts at 0, I guess, because we're computer scientists. But as you have more turns of interaction with the model, which model is the least discriminatory over interactions with multiple turns can change, right? And so people in the world are most often interacting with large language models more than just asking a question once. They might have several follow-ups. They're kind of engaged with the model over a longer time period. And if you're only kind of like, that's a reasonable way to use a model, but that's hard to develop a test for, right? And so if you are, you have this added instability from the way that the model is used in practice being much more unpredictable, but also the lack of predictability leads to a lack of generalization of your evaluation outcomes. And the same problem happens when we have hyperparameters that are left open to the user. So this was an example from an image model. I forget which exact image model this was. But there's a guidance scale, which is kind of similar to temperature for the image model, temperature being controlling essentially like how much stochasticity you have in a model's outputs. The guidance scale for an image model is closer to how kind of creative you're letting the model to be in a way. And so we see if you are evaluating how much kind of not safe for work images, is that me doing all that jostling? I hope not. Okay. If you have if you're trying to evaluate an image model for how many kind of not safe for work images there are by demographic groups of women, you know, you might at a lower guidance scale find that you can not perfectly, but somewhat control the disparity among different racial groups. But as you go to higher guidance scales, disparities for certain groups can really change, right? And so these hyperparameters that are open to the user can also change the robustness and the kind of viability, in a sense, the reasonableness of trusting these evaluation methods as well. And again, also increase the tension between who's liable for the discrimination that's being caused. Okay, so as I kind of said, I think that this is kind of, there are takeaways both for policy people and for kind of more computer science people. Something that I'm interested in after doing this work is thinking about ways that we can create more contextualized evaluations, but I guess contextualized evaluations, hopefully, and where we don't have to think of it individually for each context. Like, it would be nice to come up with general ways of creating contextualized evaluations. And then I guess for instability issues, what I've been telling people when business people come to me asking, well, what do I do about all of this? I usually say, look for patterns of good behavior and not just one example. This isn't new advice, but I think it's even more important with generative AI systems. So perturb your evaluation setup a bunch of times and make sure that you see a pattern of good behavior and not just one go. And then, in order from a research perspective, I think this is kind of a right area. I think that the problem has been kind of shown, but thinking about how to understand and navigate why this is happening in a principled way is something that I'm really interested in. So lots of work to do. Okay, how am I doing on time? Great. I will now, unless anyone has any questions. Yes.
So one question I had is, with some of these instabilities, in some sense, for example, we're looking at red teaming, even if we were human red teamer, right? Some red teamers are better than others, things like that. So is it an issue really instability, or is it an issue that it's kind of, is there any hope of, for example, coming up with, if you set your system problems in this particular way, if you do certain things, you'll end up with a strong red team, or you'll end up with a strong whatever, or do you feel like there's kind of not really much hope in that route, and it's more that they have to do these sensitivity analyses across the settings to kind of find these patterns in desirable behavior?
That's a really good question. I think red teaming in general is not my favorite evaluation method potentially, but I think to me, it seems like the more basic problem to figure out and understand how to navigate is where the instability and the baseline just model responses are coming from. And then hopefully, there have been some papers that I've seen recently that show which semantic patterns seem to be important to the model in terms of leading to a difference in opinion or outcome. And so if we can maybe a little bit more in a more principled manner, map the kinds of changes that seem to be important to how the model outputs things, that'll give us a clue to at least at first get a stable answer to the things that we're asking. And then there's a separate question of making sure that we're asking the right thing, which is, I think, more the question of the first experiment. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think first understand why we're getting instability, and then use that to make sure that when we're doing a contextualized evaluation, we're getting a reasonable response. Yeah. Great question, though. Yeah.
Regarding the that model that don't necessarily, or not that necessarily being used for downstream decision making in the past, is there any legal framework?
We're gonna get there.
That for ensuring that the people are not biased, or is that all free speech?
I will tell you in about 2 minutes. Yes. Any other questions on stuff before I move on? Maybe we're all curious about that. Oh, sorry, my blind. Yes, go ahead.
It seems to me part of the problem is coming up with a set of standards and what is the base truth for what makes some content toxic. So are there any efforts to sort of catalog what makes something toxic to our model?
That's a really good question. I think that some companies are trying to figure out stuff like that. And I think that there are large-scale user studies that are being done by tech companies to try to understand what's the line at which some content becomes toxic. I think that there are, when you are using any kind of model for a important decision-making task, for example, in employment, there is an entire area of research called industrial psychology, IO psychology, that has thought about what is kind of the right way to make a decision about whether or not someone's a good fit for a particular job. Everyone has different thoughts about to what extent IO psychology. People have thoughts on that. I have my own. I'll be happy to tell you offline, but there is research that has been done to kind of see, what do we think is a valid way to make this kind of a decision? What do we think is a reasonable thing to rely on? All that kind of stuff. So I think the answer would be there are some situations where people have thought about this in a careful way, and then I think there are some places where people are starting to, but I think there's interest for stuff like toxicity. I know that there exists a literature for employment. I think it's kind of a area by area thing, if that makes sense.
Okay. I think that it would probably benefit from some sort of standard training for considering questions basically what is fair. So sorry.
I'm sure we can talk about that offline. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I got a question about other, unless there was another thing here, other GenAI relevant laws. Do you have a question? No. Okay, sorry. Okay. So we talked about discrimination law relevant to generative AI and how it still applies, but sometimes it's not a good fit. Are there any other legal frameworks of note that can help deal with the harms that happen in these systems? Because obviously, not all generative AI systems are being used in housing, credit, and employment, which is where the main discrimination statutes in the U.S. apply. Yes, I think so. So there is a consumer protection law called UDAP, which is unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices. This comes from a couple of different places in the law. One is the FTC Article 5, and then the other is the Dodd-Frank Act, which is the act that came after the 2008 financial crisis to make sure that banks were not doing crazy things. And what this statute basically says is that it wants to prevent unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices of consumer products. So it's protecting consumers from these types of behavior in products that they have access to. So what do they think of as unfair? It's an act or practice that causes substantial injury to consumers. They can't be reasonably able to avoid this injury, and the injury can't be outweighed by countervailing benefits to consumers or competition. This is similar to the disparate impact framework that I talked about earlier, but it also has some important differences. I won't go into that too much. The deceptive prong, so this I think is great because it has a wider coverage than traditional discrimination law has, and so it could apply to some generative AI harms in a wider range of products. But I think something that is really interesting that I'm going to talk about for an extra 30 seconds is this deceptive prong, which is that there is some kind of practice that is likely to mislead the consumer. The consumer has to be kind of like a reasonable misconception. And this materiality thing, that the representation is material, just usually means that it needs to be written down or visible in some way. Yes.
This is cool to make sure I understand. This would apply to, like, in the hiring setting, the consumer would be the employer, not the candidate. So you have to show that it's harming the, or could it be otherwise?
It is usually, the cases that I've seen have largely been for the end consumer, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. I don't see why it wouldn't be able to think of a company as a consumer, but I'm honestly not familiar. I don't know. I can't give you a 100% answer to that question, but certainly end consumers like us, right? The abusive prong is also cool. I won't talk about it as much. But yeah, I know that I've said this twice already, but one of the things that makes this cool is that it applies to all consumer products, which is much less limited than just housing, credit, and employment decision-making systems. And those laws also have kind of, the way that they're written sometimes can put really big restrictions on who is liable for a discrimination that's caused. So, like, for example, in the employment setting, you can only hold an employer or kind of like a staffing agency liable. And so this has led to a lot fewer employment discrimination cases happening in practice, even when we see employment discrimination related activity from, say, a big tech company, because they're just not the kind of entity that has historically been held liable. And so this leads to a lot of kind of less action than we might hope for. But this UDAP doctrine potentially could have a wider reach. The downside, of course, is that no one has really thought to use it for these kinds of things before. But the bright side is, which I'll talk about on like the penultimate slide, is that few states, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and I think one other, have explicitly said that they are looking to use the UDAP statute to prevent AI discrimination. So I think if it hasn't happened yet, it might happen in the next couple of months or years. So specifically, why do I think, this unfairness thing, I think, is a wider way that we can attack discrimination in AI systems and Gen AI systems. But what I think is particularly interesting for generative AI systems is I think that UDAP also can be a tool to prevent harm and hallucinations. So this deceptive prong, if you have, say, a chatbot that's on some website, say you have it on some health care website, like an insurance provider or a hospital, and you ask some question like, does my insurance cover this procedure? And the model says, yes, it does. Absolutely. I'm a chatbot on your insurance provider's website, and I'm going to say, yes, it does. But there's this little message down here that says, hey, by the way, small print, this is generated by AI and might not be accurate medical advice or accurate insurance advice, right? And so there's very clear legal precedent that from the UDAP statute, what's called a pro forma disclaimer, which is something that's like a generalized disclaimer, that's not changing based off of the information that's provided to you, is not enough to cure otherwise deceptive messages or practices. So basically what the case law says is that if the overall vibe of the information you're getting is that this is a trustworthy piece of information, which generative AI systems are really good at doing, they're really good at giving you information that seems very plausible but might not be, right? A small disclaimer that doesn't like fully change that impression is definitely not enough to get you out of this deceptive liability framework. Yeah.
This is super cool. So if it was the worst chatbot, then it might be enough, right?
Yeah, fine. That would be the case. Yeah. I think you could still make the case, but I think it would be weaker. Yeah. So this is something that I've been thinking a bunch about. Feel free to talk to me about this. This work is unpublished still, so be nice. But yes, I'm really excited about this, and I think that this is some coverage showing that there have been state attorneys general that have specifically called out that they're willing to use UDAP to prevent discrimination in AI systems. So I'm again excited about where this might go in the next couple of months or years. And I guess something that I want to say a little bit more broadly is I know that this can be a little bit of an trying time thinking about preventing harms in AI systems, but laws still exist and are still very much being enforced. Here's just a smattering of some of the state and local laws that are preventing discrimination in the US. And again, statements about state authorities being poised and ready to use the statutes that they do have, and every state has a UDAP statute, to use the laws that they have to prevent AI discrimination on the ground. So not all hope is lost. Don't fret too much, or at least try not to. And then I guess one last thing that I'll say, because I think I should probably be wrapping up soon, is that if anyone wants to talk to me about it later, another just PSA that I want to have out that is also relevant to some work that I'm doing with Charlotte Burrows and Jenny Yang, who used to be at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Pauline Kim, who I think we have some friends up here as well, is to not, overread into the executive orders that have come out that seem to be pushing against discrimination law that exists right now. So in particular, there's a pretty concerted effort to push back against disparate impact liability. And I think two things to remember here. One is that this is just enforcement, so the law still exists, at least for now. But two, I can go more into this if we want to talk offline, but the case that these executive orders make is basically that disparate impact liability requires a company to essentially make a lot of changes to a decision-making system if there's any evidence of discrimination, of disparate impact, of differences in allocation rates between different demographic groups. And that's just factually not the case. Written into the law of disparate impact is the fact that you only need to do so if there is no business necessity that essentially excuses that discrimination in that particular instance. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. One, executive orders don't change the law. If you're not, familiar, it can change enforcement, but not the law because it's the executive branch. And two, the claims that are being made are based off of a very gross and inexcusable misreading of the law. And I'm working on a piece with Charlotte, Pauline, and Jenny about how both, explaining why not to read into these executive orders too much, but also making the case that, at least in the case of employment, the laws that exist on the books actually do require you to debias an AI system as you are creating it. I'm happy to talk to anyone about this offline, but basically, because employment requires a model to be valid and that it's making its decisions in a reasonable way, this validity requirement actually necessitates that you debias as you're creating a system. So that's another strain of work that I'm kind of excited about, but also just wanted to have this PSA, about these things that are going on. So I had a time permitting piece, but as I might have expected, I won't be getting to that. If anyone wants to talk to me about generative monoculture, multilingual prompting, feel free to talk to me offline, which is cool and fun. But with that, I will end. And if you want to talk to me about any of these things, please don't hesitate to reach out.